as with all of the others, the cascading vision, actually, I could have drawn this a number of different ways, but the organization needs to cascade their vision down into the product program, line management, business owner part of the organization. They need to cascade their vision down into the team level and then ultimately down to the individual. All of these need to align, and if they are not aligned, it will make it very difficult to be able to have an organization that is functioning well, and it will also lengthen the time that it will take to roll out, scale, and transform the organization, and it will make governing a agile organization more difficult if you don't do the upfront homework in order to make everything successful. So you got to do the spade work. You got to get out the shovel, and the behavior needs to be modeled and demonstrated in all four boxes. In the fifth tile, by the way, we're going to talk about a couple things. We're going to talk here about the Stacey diagram, and then we're going to talk about anticipatory vision and which boxes we use those in. Now, we ran into something very interesting with a recent project. And as the Flow Certified Professional, Robert, who was looking at this, as he was looking at it, he went, wow, this is really, really tough to figure out. Why is this team struggling so much? Because we know that the technology is known. We know that the requirements are stable, and we have all the requirements. Why is this team languishing and not able to deliver a very simple infrastructure project? And as Robert was looking here at the Stacey diagram, it dawned on him that the communications, the green dot, were complex. And that is probably one of the best arguments ever. You almost have to think in 3 dimensions here. That's one of the best arguments ever of why you should use Agile everywhere. Because these days, I haven't seen a project where the communications didn't quickly become complicated or complex. And as you're moving into complex communications, that overrides the fact that, okay, the requirements could be simple and the technology could be simple, and it's known. All of a sudden, now you're looking at needing to use agile techniques and methodologies in order to be able to deliver due to the complexity of the situation you are in. So, when you're looking at Stacey diagrams in the future, or Cynefin, if you use the Cynefin 4-box, that's used widely in Europe. Cynefin is basically something put together by Dave Snowden about 6 or 7 years after Stacey did this particular diagram. They both communicate the same thing. The thing I like about Cynefin is that because of where you've got simple in the right lower box, you've got complicated in the upper right box, complex in the upper left box, and chaos and anarchy in the lower left. So chaos and anarchy end up right next to simple. And so you have this little cliff that most organizations don't realize, that you can fall off being in the simple box of best practices. You can quickly fall into chaos and anarchy without realizing it. And so in that sense, sometimes it's very useful to use the Cynefin diagram. But in this case, it was very good to use the Stacey diagram, because you can quickly see as you're moving out away from simple, which many agilists or would say that, yeah, if it's simple, just use a checklist or use a napkin or use traditional classic waterfall to get those done. What you have in front of you is the best argument to never do that. Because we used to teach in the classic style of project management that project management is 80% communications. Well, these days it's 90 or 95% communications. And I would suggest that if you've got anything that's complicated, complex, or into the chaos anarchy zone, you need to be using Agile. And so it's a beautiful way to communicate that while on the surface, if you use the Stacey diagram the old way and not add the extra dimension of communications, you could get fooled into thinking that, oh, well, we can just use traditional classic on that. But as you start to peel back the layers of the onion, you go, oh, yeah, this is complex communication. Well, that means that we should actually be using Agile instead of traditional classic waterfall or a checklist or whatever. So food for thought, something for you guys to think about, but it's not always as straightforward as you think it is. And so many thanks to Robert for catching that one. That was just really, really good. I appreciate that. The following types of vision. This is based on two books by Dr. Daniel Burris. His first book that he's probably written more, but his book on Flash Foresight looked at the difference being reactive, proactive, and preactive. Okay. Reactive and proactive we've had in literature and in management theory and education since the 80s. I mean, we were talking about that when I did my BA and finished that in 83, and we were still talking about it when I did my MBA in 93 and finished it then. And what Dr. Burris started to head towards was being preactive is one step beyond proactive. And it's being able to measure the trend lines of what's happening in the future, that where it's these almost flashes of insight that you would get, and that's almost on the anticipatory side. But preactive is being able to take the trends, take the trend lines, and make relatively good estimates and guesses based on those trend lines. Okay, so for example, preactive would be here in Finland. The economists had shared for decades, hey, people, our population pyramid's upside down. And no one is addressing the fact that with an upside down pyramid, as people get older and older, the pressure and burden that that's going to place on the healthcare system could literally crush the system. And so the economists were warning based on what the trend lines were saying and what the projected tax revenues were saying, is that we're going to run into a situation where you're not going to be able to solve this. Now, that has manifested itself in that at least the last two, it might even be the last three, governments here in Finland have fallen more or less over the healthcare issue, and that none of the parties have any solution on how to finance the ballooning cost of healthcare. Anticipatory vision, which Dr. Burse has a whole book about, takes and builds on Flash Foresight, and it almost becomes these flashes of brilliance that you get where it's you don't even know where it comes from, but it's also based on trends. I remember sitting in a meeting with some of the leaders from Nokia, and this is back when the iPhone 1 came out. And they were messing with me, and they're like, hey, Andrew, what do you think about this iPhone? What do you think it's going to do? And I walked up to the whiteboard and I drew 3 arcs, sort of like a staircase, but with arcs. And in between at the end of the first arc, I wrote the number 1. At the end of the second arc, I wrote the number 10. And at the third one, I wrote 100. And they're like, well, what's that? I said, well, the first Apple here is probably going to sell a million units, and then they'll follow up with the second version of Apple, and that will sell 10 million units. And the third version of Apple will sell 100 million units, and at that point, you're dead. And they started laughing at me, and they said, oh, Andrew, that's never going to happen. We own Africa and Asia and Europe, and we sell 462 million handsets a year. That will never happen. In fact, the current iPhone, it doesn't even have an alarm clock. And I looked at them and I said, wow, that's really interesting. Okay, well, you guys get the big bucks. Obviously, you know something I don't know. But my view is that based on the trends that I've seen, based on what I know, by the way, I had talked to my friends who were deep into Apple at that time, and they were laughing, and they said, Nokia just doesn't get the ecosystem that Apple is building. They're going to have millions of programmers working for free in the hopes that the app that they release turns them into a millionaire. And so there's no way any single company can compete with an army of that size, creating features and applications for a phone that was just basically an operating system. But the ecosystem is what differentiated Nokia or Apple from Nokia, and Apple's strategy worked. A couple years later, Marco, I think it was, sent an email to me after I don't remember if it was the Apple II or Apple III, whenever those came out. He sends me an email, and that particular version of the phone had sold 1 million units the first week. And he sent an email to me, Andrew, you were right. And I sent a note back to him and I said, Marco, what does it matter? Nobody listened. And then he sends another note back and he goes, Andrew, can I share that with Yorma? I said, yeah, sure, feel free. And never heard from any of them again. And for me, I wish I had followed my own advice. I'd be sitting in the Bahamas right now on the beach enjoying a very nice view. But at that time, I wasn't very Apple friendly. Anyways, but it was a perfect example of anticipatory vision where you have this flash of brilliance and everything becomes very clear on what's on the horizon. And based on trends, based on gut intuition, based on experience, you're able to synthesize all those in a flash and create what we call anticipatory vision. Your product owners had better be able to do that if you want to be able to survive, or at least somebody in the hierarchy, whether it's at the program level, most likely at the portfolio level. Most likely your portfolio people and above had better have the ability not just to be reactive or proactive, they better be able to be preactive and even into those flashes of brilliance with anticipatory vision. Now, theoretically, both of these work in all 4 boxes, but for me, I would more likely use the Stacey diagram at the individual and team levels to help them focus. But for the product level and above, your teams and your product owners and your program managers and your business managers and everybody from that level up had better have some skills and abilities in being more than just reactive or proactive. They better be able to be preactive and even anticipatory if you want any hopes of your organization surviving. I think I saw a statistic recently where like 25% of the Fortune 500 that were on the list 10 years ago, they're not there anymore. So the rate at which companies are disappearing has accelerated. And if you want any hope of surviving in the future, your agile coaches and your enterprise agile coaches need to understand how to use both sets of these diagrams in order to help your teams and organization be able to deliver the outstanding value that you want to deliver to your customers. Because if you aren't able to deliver that to your customers, then whatever you're doing doesn't matter. It's not sustainable.